limitations and vulnerabilities, and a compulsive list maker. This I know because I attended one talk of his long back where he made lists and the talk was about his lists. Please welcome the one and only Stefan Sagmeister. Stefan, all yours.
Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to talk to you here from New York City. I'm in my studio doing well. New York is, of course, very much in its reawakening phase. Meaning, I think I've never seen my neighborhood as absolutely crowded and alive than I've seen it in the last couple of days. We're really getting out of this, and I know that not everywhere in the world, and I'm sure not every place in India is in the same lucky situation, but it very much looks like I think that within some delay we're all getting into a better space slowly but surely. And I will share my screen and get hopefully right into it. I think that you should all be hopefully able to see a
Yes.
fairly big hello right now on a black
Yes.
background. Excellent. So then I think we jump right into it. I'll get to meaty things at the very end of my talk, but I actually wanted to spend quite some time on this question that I've been asked many, many times, and I know is on at least some designer's mind, which is really about, is there a difference between design and art? And if there is, should we care? And uh, in my case, about 20 years ago, we were about to design our first album cover for the Rolling Stones. And I met up with Mr. Jagger. And one of the questions that I asked him was, what is your favorite cover from the past? And without any hesitation, he said, Exile on Main Street, Some Girls, and Sticky Fingers. And I said, well, then we're going to have a very easy time working together, because I would have picked the exact same three covers. I would have put them in a somewhat different sequence. I would have said Sticky Fingers, Some Girls, and Exile on Main Street. And then upon which I see Charlie Watts sort of leaning over to Mr. Jagger and asking, like, very in a very low voice, what's on Sticky Fingers? And Jagger answered, well, it's the one that Andy did, the one with the zipper. And then, of course, Sticky Fingers was designed by Andy Warhol, and Some Girls by Peter Corriston, and Exile on Main Street by Robert Frank. So what's happening here really now is that these three album covers were actually designed by three people in completely different professions. The first one, of course, was designed by an artist, Andy Warhol. The second one by a graphic designer, Peter Corriston, and the third one by a photographer, a guy who sort of lives in between those two worlds, half in the art world and half in the documentary world. And when I'm asked if I see myself as a designer or an artist, I always say that I'm a designer. Because of those reasons. I went to design school, I worked for design studios. I really like to speak in the language of design. I work within the economy. I'm a designer. Now, of course, as a private person, like, I might pick up, let's say, a bottle of milk in the supermarket and then meet a friend for lunch in the social space, and then possibly check out an exhibition at MoMA. So in my regular day, the difference between these spaces is basically fluid. Actually, they can really merge together. Let's say if I would buy a book, so being in the commercial space, with a friend together, being in the social space, at the MoMA bookshop, being in the cultural space, I really do all three things at the same time. And if I don't really see any differentiation in my private life, why should I care in my professional life? Well, one reason to care is because the world really does see a difference. A design studio is different from an art studio. Design works through clients, art works through galleries. Design books rarely feature artists, art magazines rarely feature designers. And if I ask designers about their favorite artists, they probably know Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons, but not so much more. And if I ask my artist friends about their favorite designers, they might have heard of possibly Milton Glaser because of the I Love New York logo, but not so much more. And I would say that my favorite distinction between the two comes from a designer artist, but mostly a guy who is known within the art world, Donald Judd, who separates the two of them neatly by function. Design has to work, art really doesn't. Art can just be, it really doesn't have to do anything. And I went to the Guggenheim in Bilbao, and it was fascinating to me to see all these fantastic Richard Serra sculptures. And at the very end, they had a screen with an interview with Richard Serra. And they were busy talking about how these things have been manufactured in big German shipyards. And then, almost apropos of nothing, the interviewer asks Richard Serra, "Tell me, Richard, what is art good for?" And I thought, oh my God, how does he answer such a difficult, crazy question? And literally, without skipping a beat, Richard Serra said, "The purpose of art is to have no purpose." And then he went on and said, "It really is the job of a good artist to create his or her own world. And we as viewers are allowed to look into that world, possibly compare it to our own, and enrich our own life through that experience." I thought it was as good of an explanation about art as I've never heard. So, as I've ever heard. So basically, is it as that easy as that? On the one hand, design just has to function and art doesn't have to function. Well, sadly, it really isn't. Obviously, good design has to do much more than just to function. And most art really does more than just to be. Meaning, I went just before the pandemic, I was actually in China, in Shanghai, and I was at the Museum of Contemporary Art and looked at this Mark Bradford exhibit, a Los Angeles painter. And if you, this is me going through it with the iPhone, very clearly, these people use Mark Bradford's art as a backdrop for their selfies, So that's clearly is one function that this art has. Very much likely, or almost for sure, not planned so by the artist, but it's a function that came out of itself, a side function. But there's many functions to contemporary art. It can be used as an investment. It can be used as a conversation starter. It can be used as proof that I am richer than you, as a differentiator of the person who has $10 billion to make a difference between that person and the person who only has a $1 billion, because maybe that $1 billion can't afford the $400 million Basquiat painting for their living room. And then, of course, itself, throughout history, there was a lot of art that did function quite a lot. Meaning it worked as decoration, as an economic currency, as religious or even political propaganda. Meaning, if you look even at the very, very height of art, this is Michelangelo designing a candlestick holder, very clearly a functional object. Or maybe most famously and fantastically, when Leonardo da Vinci needed a job, he wrote a letter to the Duke of Milan praising his own CV, his own curriculum vitae, offering the following services. Number one, I have plans for strong bridges. Two, I can make an infinite number of scaling ladders. Three, I have methods of destroying fortresses. Four, I can build many types of portable cannons. I'll assemble efficient catapults. I'll have examples of fire-resistant chips. I can conduct water from one place to another. And then last, he says, also, I can paint. So the creator of possibly the single most famous painting in human history thought that his design skills were really far more valuable to the Duke than his artistic talents. So I would say I would call this 1-0 for team design. Now, if we look at design, is that really all it needs to do to function? Well, I would say that when design only functions, it really is functionalism, and that most of the time makes it really bad design. Meaning these housing blocks that went up under the mantle of functionalism really needed to be broken down 20 years later because of high crime rates, because people really didn't want to live in these blocks. They did not function for human habitation. So it's an ironic thing that they were built under functionalism, and the one thing that they didn't do was they didn't want to function. Now, of course, the equivalent to the 1970s housing block really is, I would say, Twitter, the most functional of all the social media platforms, where people are, just like in the housing blocks, much more aggressive than they are in other areas or even on other social media. The main reason, or I would say one of the main reasons I am on Instagram and not on Twitter, is because people are much nicer on Instagram. And I would wager this has something to do also with the fact that there is more aesthetics, more joy, not pure function on Instagram. Instagram also functions much better than Twitter. It grows 10 times as fast, it's 3 times as big. So, from a pure functionality point of view, Instagram is a much better functioning platform than Twitter is. So I would say that for design to be good, it really has to help somebody, it has to have that function, but it also really needs to delight somebody. We really have to stop thinking of ourselves as problem solvers. We have to bring in beauty on the same level as functionality. Problem solving leads to things like this, like, somebody needed an underpass, somebody built it, but it really didn't do anything else but allow you to walk underneath a street. And we need to really make sure that this can also be joyful. The same would be true for this bridge. Somebody needed a reason a way to cross this river and didn't really think as it would be possible to make this a more joyful experience. And of course, I'm not really about to argue we should build shitty things and then fix them later on. We should build beautiful things to start out with, like this fantastic footbridge by my friend Thomas Hedderwick in London, where the function and the joy of the bridge really is built into one single unified unit. Now, I would say that throughout history, there were plenty of eras and times where design and art really became super close to each other. And I grew up in that sort of culture. Meaning, like, when I studied in Vienna, the big local artists, the big artists, they had already died by then, of course, but the big artists that were dominating Vienna was, of course, Klimt and Schiele. And Klimt designed many, many posters, and so very much did Chile, and so did Kokoschka. And they didn't just do posters for their own shows; they did posters for literary events, for books, and so on. So it became very much a one one direction sort of thing. And they were very proud that they would also do the applied arts. And that probably was an influence on the Bauhaus that came very much later, where literally everybody was proud and very clearly designing in all sorts of direction. If you look at Josef Albers, that, whose paintings now cost in the millions, but he really saw himself as an architect, and he designed many things like these tables that are still available and you can still buy them from the same manufacturer. He did things for cooking, he designed album covers, and of course he also made paintings, and then he even made those paintings later into posters again. And we see some of that still going on really throughout history, like, maybe the inventor of the modern magazine layout, Alexander Lieberman, who also was very successful with getting work into the Guggenheim, into the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Or, possibly one of the most prolific brand designers of our time, my friend Paul Lager, who designed some of the most important branding systems or widely spread branding systems anywhere, of course, also is doing quite well with the paintings of her map that she shows quite successfully at galleries. And of course, many important artists started out as designers. Barbara Kruger, her philosophy-driven typographic statements were surely influenced by the fact that for many, many years she was the design director of Mademoiselle magazine before she actually switched into fine art. And of course, the most famous switcher by far would be Andy Warhol, who had enjoyed an illustrious and extremely successful career as a commercial illustrator. He won many New York art directors gold medals before he decided to switch into fine art full time. And with him, it really the question of art or design and design or art really becomes super complex, because he actually created art, he made art in order to finance his design project. He created these, portraits of celebrities, but also of, finance people or CEOs of big companies, really to finance his graphic design project, his interview magazine. And long after he was established as an artist, he still made album covers, and some of them, definitely this one for the Velvet Underground, I would say was higher in quality than many of those portraits that he really painted for money. And then it gets even more complex. As a pop artist, Andy Warhol was very much in opposition to the then reigning artistic style, which was abstract expressionism. And if you look at the leading abstract expressionists like Willem de Kooning here on the left, or Jackson Pollock, or Franz Klein, this is a group of quite macho painters that were very much into form. Now, when the pop artists came in, and Warhol, Jasper Johns, or Robert Rauschenberg, you can already see the difference, not just from their paintings, but even in their appearance. This is a completely different group of people. And in 1964, Andy Warhol showed not just the now super famous pillow box, but he showed a whole bunch of different packages. There was Heinz ketchup, there was Campbell tomatoes juice packaging, there was Mott's apple juice, and so on, not just the Brillo box. But somehow only the Brillo box became this icon of pop art, and maybe even an icon of 20th century art in general. None of the others really managed to do that. And this might have something to do with the fact that the Brillo box, the commercial Brillo box, was actually designed by an abstract expressionist painter, by James Harvey, who, considering he didn't make much money as an abstract expressionist, on the weekend moonlighted as a commercial person, and he designed the Brillo box. So what we have here really is we have a case where a designer who became an artist took a piece of design that has been created by an artist who moonlighted as a designer and then transformed that into a fine art. I would say, let's call this one even. So when we talk about function, it is good to remember that this really isn't an on-off kind of proposition. It's not like, oh, it's either function or it isn't function. Let's say it's a sort of like a sliding scale from high to low and low to high. If we look at architecture, a factory is highly functional. It has all these things, like, it has, I don't know, like, offices, canteens, bathrooms, and so a cathedral, or a temple for that matter, it has very low functionality. No bathrooms, no kitchens in the cathedral. The same would be true for transportation design. Let's say a cement truck has a high degree of functionality. It can do many things. A super sports car, not so much. Or in graphics, let's say a text form, high degree of functionality. A article in a music magazine that's all set in dingbats, very low set of functionality. But when you check with yourself, do you know the designer, the name of the designer of your country's tax form? Or do you know which designer that was that set that music magazine article in Dingbats? Well, chances are you know the later. Yes, it's David Carson, and chances are you've never heard of the former, even though arguably the cultural impact of the text form is much, much, much higher, much bigger distribution, makes a much bigger difference in people's lives than a layout in a music magazine. And I, of course, was always drawn to areas of graphics, of communication design, that had a low functionality to start out with. I really love designing album covers because of their low functionality. Yes, they had to ultimately protect a vinyl piece or a CD, but still you could really put a lot of emotionality into it. The functionality of it didn't really have to be that high. And then, of course, there are some pitfalls. Let's say, I already mentioned one of my favorite artists of all time, Donald Judd. Well, he also designed some design pieces, and I myself have 5 nephews, 6 nieces, 7 grandnieces, and 8 grandnephews. And I think I cannot imagine a single one of them being happy to spend the night in his children bed that he designed, I think, for his own kids. However, I think Donald Judd's example is one of very few, and the other side actually happens much more often, that you have designers, specifically designers my age, sort of designers when they reach their 50s, when they kind of get pissy about having to answer to their clients, that they transform themselves from having been really good designers and now creating really bad art. I mean, if you look at one of the originators of graphic design, Lucian Bernhard, the guy who really helped to create the modern poster. Well, later in life, he created these quite awful sculptures. I've recently seen one at auction. It sold for $240, which I think is lower than the material value of this sculpture. Similar, one of the giants of American design, Paul Rand, later in life created these paintings that looked a little bit like Klee, but like Paul Klee, but not quite as good. So I'd say that the designers score into their own goal and art is ahead 1-2. So let's look at both fields from a fairness and justice point of view. I would say that in general, I can say that design objects are more democratic because they're endlessly reproducible, have often a much wider distribution, and I think in many cases reach a much more diverse audience. If I look at the JC cover that we designed a good number of years ago, that started with an initial print run of 5 million copies. Now, even the most wildly distributed art printed out piece, let's say like the catalog of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, doesn't really reach those kind of numbers. Then, of course, as already said, design we really deal with clients. Many of those clients have learned their profession and by and large really are professionals. In the art world, many people start a gallery because they like art. Then 1 or 2 years into it, they discover that it's actually a business and they are sort of start to be a little crookish and then a little bit more crookish. I mean, I know so many stories of my artist friends, of galleries who didn't pay them, of suddenly a discovery that a piece was sold, that the gallery never told them that the piece was sold, and so on and so forth. In design, we did hundreds of jobs in my studio, and we basically always got paid with this one exception. Now, I would say that in the art world, sometimes even something that sounds very much like cheating is legal. I mean, the New York Times wrote about this habit of auction houses called chandelier bidding, where the auctioneer says 1.4, 1.5, 1.6, but actually nobody said 1.5. He made it up. So the person who wound up paying 1.6 really was cheated out of $100,000, which seems very close to fraud to me. Now, so I would say in this case, design catches up. It is 2-2. Well, then let's look at both fields about branding. You would think that branding plays a much bigger role in the commercial role, but let's look at it. In the commercial sphere, if you want to get a bottle of aspirin, you can buy it for 450, a generic version, or you can buy the brand name version if you want to have the security of a big name like Bayer. If you want the Bayer aspirin, you pay basically 4 times as much for that kind of brand, for that sort of security. And if we look at an extreme case within the commercial world, a fashion accessory, in this case, it would be the Birkin bag from Hermes. You can buy a copy down on Cornell Street that looks quite similar to the Birkin bag for about $200, or you can buy an original if you can get your hands on it for about $8,000. So basically, you're willing to pay a factor of 40 times as much to get the original bag from the original designer in the original quality. In the art world, it's quite different. You can have a choice to buy an original Jeff Koons balloon dog for 91 million, or you can buy a copy, a Chinese copy that sort of looks similar to it for about 2,000 bucks. So there, the factor is really on a completely different scale. You pay 40,000 times as much for the security to actually own this original. And of course, you pay for the brand mostly, for the brand of the artist who made it. You pay for the brand of the gallery who exhibited it, of the collector who owned it, of the museum that showed it, and of the auction house that you actually ultimately bought it from. It's brand on top of brand on top of brand on top of brand. So I would say it design scores here, it is 3-2. Now, I'm not a big believer in number theory, but it has to be said that, and you won't notice that, but within Austria, my home country, 3-2 is one of the most famous numbers. I mean, you can, if you ever run into an Austrian, walk up to him or her and say 3-2, and they will probably whisper Krankel or Cordoba, because the year was 1978, so it was almost 40 or a bit over 40 years ago when the Austrian soccer team beat Germany in the World Cup. And of course, since this only has been 41 years ago, we are still very much gloating about it. And here you go.
Ball reinholen, fast nach links darüber. Es gibt Beifall, da kommt Kranke, verteidigt man es in Wacker, ist im Strafraum, Schuss. Tor! 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 Ivanarisch, Kranke schießt ein. 3-2 für Österreich.
You've heard it, 3-2 für Österreich, 3-2 für Design. Now, I'm usually not in the habit of quoting Foucault or Adorno. It was always sounded a little pompous to me, but I just couldn't resist when I found this one. So this is very famous, one of the most famous philosophers of the 20th century, saying that freedom from purpose and purposefulness can never be absolutely separated from each other. There is no chemically pure purposefulness. Even the most pure form of purpose are nourished by ideas, formal transparency, which in fact are derived from the artistic practice. So basically what he says, it's impossible to create something that is purely functional or something that is purely non-functional. So basically what he says, there is no pure art and there is no pure design. There literally is only the in-betweens. You would have something that is quite functional, like the text form. You have maybe something in the middle, like a magazine layout. And then you have, I don't know, an Anselm Kiefer painting. But none of these things are pure. They're just sort of like different things on a scale. Or if I look at our own work, I would say that a website for a museum has a lot of functionality on the left. Maybe an album cover might be somewhere in the middle, but then 6,500 bananas glued onto a wall in a gallery, slowly rotting away and changing the typography, really has very little function. But ultimately, all of them are just somewhere on a scale. And I would say that in the past 2 years or so, we in the studio decided to move all of the very functional work over to Jessica's side, which she does under the name And Volge. And I myself really dedicated myself to the creation of work with very low function on the very right side of that spectrum. So I'll show you what I've been doing the past year and a half or so with a project that's very close to my heart called Beautiful Numbers. And it really all started when I was a resident at the American Academy in Rome. They gave me this beautiful studio and they had these fantastic dinners every night, wonderful, where you sat next to somebody else every single evening, like, you know, an archaeologist, a painter, a writer, a architect, a designer. And one night I wound up next to a very very intelligent lawyer, and he told me that what we see right now happening in Poland, happening in Hungary, happening in Brazil, is really the end of liberal democracy. And that evening after dinner, I went back to my studio and basically looked it up. What happened in the past 200 years? when did liberal democracy start? Where is it now? And it turned out that 200 years ago in 1821, there was really one democracy, the United States. 100 years later, after World War I, there were roughly 18 democratic countries. And now in 2021, there are 96 democratic countries. It's the first time in human history that more than half of the human population actually lives within a democratic system. And the interesting thing is, my lawyer friend could not have been more wrong. He completely, utterly misjudged the world that he is living in. Not only do we see the end of liberal democracy, we live in the absolute golden age of liberal democracy. And that was interesting to me. It was just interesting to see that a highly educated, smart person would judge the world that he's living in so completely, demonstrably wrongly. And I, of course, gave it some thought why that is. Well, one of them is how media developed. The cycle of media became shorter and shorter. We went from yearly to monthly to weekly magazines to daily newspapers to hourly cable news to all the time on Twitter. And the shorter the cycle gets, the less subtle, the less room is there for subtleties, the less room is there for small improvements, the more need there is for quick hitting scandals, for quick hitting catastrophes. So if you look at Twitter, you think our world that we are all standing on the edge of nothing. But if you look at the world from a very long perspective, from a very long point of view, actually the opposite really comes across. We all agree on that life is better than death. We prefer food over being hungry. We'd rather be knowledgeable than ignorant. We rather live in a democracy than within a dictatorship. We prefer health over sickness and really prefer peace over war. And the fact is that all of these things can be measured, and all of these things actually have been measured over the past 200 years, and all of them have improved. Now, of course, these are statistics, and the statistics come from authoritative sources, some from the World Bank, some from the UN. This is not some tiny university who makes this up. But of course, statistics being statistics, they kind of remain cold. So let's have a look at my old family. These are my great-great-grandparents, Jacob and Johanna. Now we know that the death of a child is really among the worst things that could possibly happen to any parents anywhere. So, and they experienced such a catastrophe not one time or twice in their life. They experienced that 6 times. 6 of their children died. And that was not unusual for their times. This was basically just normal, where only 60% of all kids actually survived into adulthood. Now, the next generation of Sagmeisters didn't do all that much better. 5 of their kids died. They actually belonged, strangely, even though they were quite poor, they belonged to the elite of their generation, because they actually, both of them, could read and write. And at the time, only 15% of all their contemporaries were able to do so, to read and write. And they owned a small antique store in the very western part of Austria, and everything that they didn't sell actually was stored in the attic of the house that I grew up in. And I took some of these paintings and literally made them into new pieces by putting new abstract shapes on new canvases into these old 200-year-old paintings, merging them together to, on first glance, basically create this abstract composition, but that also is very much informed and steeped in data. So who put how much CO2 up into the air over time? Yes, that little yellow dot, over time, I mean the past 200 years. That little yellow dot is China, the light blue rectangle is the United States, and that big red shape, yes, that is Europe because of the Industrial Revolution in the past 200 years. That's how much CO2 Europe created in that time frame. My grandmother, Josephine, was actually the first woman in my family that was allowed to vote. And she had to wait until she was 42 years old because voting rights came to Austria only in 1919, female voting rights. And so that tiny little yellow dot represents how many women were allowed to vote 100 years ago worldwide, almost none. And the big purple circle represents how many women are allowed to vote now. Basically, everybody, 195 of the 196 countries that the UN recognizes as real countries, have female voting rights, and the only one that doesn't is a tiny, small one, the Vatican. Now, my grandparents really did live long enough to actually live in a democracy. This shows how democracy developed after 1945, where there were, in the beginning, 30 countries, all the way until now to 96 countries. And I'm looking at many different ideas, from suicides, how that in the US, how that's developed, on the abolishment of the death penalty, and so forth and so on. And I mean, I myself came to the United States 35 years ago, where you wouldn't have, it was unthinkable to eat the fish out of the Hudson. Today, they're really it bettered incredibly. You can go to high-end restaurants and order fish from the Hudson. This one shows how large oil spills have actually been reduced significantly over the past 50 years. There are lenticular prints that really change as you walk by, concentrating on fields where only recent data is available. We have these hand-painted glasses, and we have some espresso cups. I myself drink between 8 and 10 cups of espresso every day. Look, I have one here, one of these things here right now. And it, of course, the curve that you see reflected in the mirrored cup actually is also a curve that represents data. I just thought it would be worthwhile on a everyday kind of object to have some sort of little reminder in there that the latest tweets you just saw don't really mean that the world is about to end anytime soon. And last project in that direction that I show here is these embroideries that were made in a very particular small town in China by absolute masters of embroidery. And I should say that I'm of course completely aware that a lot of things needs to be done. A lot of things. I'm meaning specifically now during COVID in many countries, including India, we have to really, really get our shit together. I also believe that we have a better chance of getting our shit together if we build on our past successes and acknowledge these past successes, rather than live in this world of scandal and doom, where ultimately, at least in my case, I feel like I can't do anything anyway. We are close to the edge. Nothing really helps. We've had such a incredible history as humanity of actually seeing mistakes and fixing them. And sometimes, or very often, by design, the way that we fix it creates a new problem. But then, of course, we absolutely need to find a way to fix this new problem. The truth is that about 200 years ago, 90% of all people around the world lived in abject poverty. And this has been reduced down first to 25% and has been even further reduced in the last 20 years. And we are now actually at 9%. The crazy thing is that 200 years ago, the average calorie value, the average calorie intake that a person in France had was the same as 200 years later in Rwanda, when Rwanda was the most malnourished country on earth. And the UN actually predicts that we will see the end of extreme poverty in our lifetime. So, as the scientist Max Rosa points out, this headline could have run truthfully every single day for the past 25 years. Well, it went up again during COVID, but there is a good chance that in the past 2 years we are able to get down again. Well, thank you so very, very much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Stefan. That was an astounding talk. Most of the stuff that I'm getting on the chat is speechless. So if you guys have any questions that you want to ask Stefan, go ahead and send the questions over to me. One question that I have is this.
Sure.
You actually did talk about this. This is a question I posed to a speaker earlier. It's kind of probably quite relevant here. If we do see the functionality and the design, the functionality and art as or expression at two ends of the stuff, for something that you're creating and the context in which you're creating, how do you decide where you actually stay within this? You're saying that both has got to kind of manifest in everything that we do, but where is that got to be in the project or in the context that you do?
Depends on the application. Let's say if I would get a job to create a tax form, very, very clearly, the functionality of that form has to be very, very high. But why not create a beautiful tax form? Why not make it as functional as possible, but then also really look at it from an aesthetic point of view? I mean, who says that a tax form can't be beautiful? Then there should, of course, there could be maybe transitions that are just super smooth, like to really put some time. I mean, first of all, I would say eliminate everything that makes people angry. So stuff that, I've seen so many forms where you have to fill out the same situation, the same information 3 times, because the form designers were too lazy to figure this out. So first, get all of the stuff that could anger somebody or annoy somebody out of the way. Then make it, for sure, it has to be very clear and functional. But I think that there could be a little bit of joy put into a form. That could be either from a formal aesthetical color perspective, or it could be that there is just some particularly well-written prompts in there. It could be friendlier than normal, both typographically, but also how it is written. So there is all sorts of possibilities there. And I think that sometimes we see this where something that has, if you look at some of the new online banking systems, how they deal with, how they make you fill out the form is so much better than your classic bank used to do it. And the classic bank just basically, one of the problems is that they never spent any effort. It wasn't even on the front of their minds that this could also be pleasurable. Like I've spoken to so many UX designers who say that aesthetics or joy or pleasure is never on their mind. It's not even part of the conversation. It's only functionality. And that is why this world is so shitty. I mean, that's why so many of us, when they have to do something online, leave that space as fast as they can, because you don't really want to be there. It's the equivalent of, if you have to go into one of these non-areas outside in the kind of non-space in your city. You need to buy cheap furniture and you go out there into that space where it's this mixture between gas stations, fast food restaurants, and discount furniture stores. Yes, you go there because you have to be there because your car is about to run out of gas, but you would never go on a holiday there. You would never be there out of your free will. You would never want to spend any time there because ultimately you don't want to be there. But wouldn't it be fantastic if maybe it's not doable, but wouldn't it be fantastic if at least the goal of a tax form would be that it's kind of fun to fill it out? That you design it with bring in maybe a game designer. Like really, like I think that I'm not saying that this is really possible, that it actually is fun, but I'm 100% sure that it's possible to make it a much more pleasant experience.
Right. So there's a follow-up question, right?
Sure.
In this side of the world that we are sitting in, it's completely possible that aesthetics or dialing something towards aesthetics is considered. I'm not saying that I subscribe to that, but it could potentially be seen as privilege, because at the base level, people don't get aesthetics. We are actually surrounded by a lot more stuff that is probably needs to be bettered in its aesthetics than anything else. That's what you get. So
I actually would disagree with you. I've been to Rajasthan. I've seen very poor people, both on both female and men, dressed to the hilt in unbelievable colors, looking absolutely gorgeous. And these were what you would call people who lived in a base level, who took and transformed their neighborhood, their country by it. And we actually, in the show on beauty, we took a couple of pictures that I had taken in Rajasthan, and we retouched the people out.
right.
And it was transformed from a fantastic photo where you had 6 or 7 women in very colorful dress standing in there. When you took them out, it was third world anywhere. You couldn't tell anymore where it was, but it just looked like a very poor country somewhere. So I think that this is completely possible on absolutely all levels. And we actually, in the show on beauty, tried to make some pieces, or tried to show some pieces that were made with very little material value. So we had a big installation on the ceiling that was garbage bags that slowly blew up and deflated again. It was completely mesmerizing. Very people felt it was meditative and laid underneath that installation. It was garbage bags. And we had another installation made by a French designer who lives in Mexico City, who makes rococo-like chandeliers out of the garbage that's from the garbage piles in Mexico City, collected by literally the single poorest class in all of Mexico City. And there are many poor classes there. So while it is true, sometimes if you look at a cathedral or at a high-end temple, money is very much involved into creating something beautiful, but not necessarily. I think that far more important to it than financial inputs is the willingness and the desire of the doers, of the designers, to go in that direction. Because the truth, of course, is that making something functional that is at the same time beautiful is way more difficult than just making something functional. See,
True.
designers love function because it's so unbelievably easy to do. Most of the function that we do is like a joke. It's not even a job, it's a joke. I mean, and and that's why we love it so much, because it makes our job so easy. And all those guys who who talk in conferences, oh, I'm not about beauty. I'm all about, like, I'm a problem solver. Yeah, fuck you. It's like the problems you solve are idiotic. They're like so easy. It's just not even discussable.
Let's switch gear. I've got one more question from Malavika. She says, I feel dignity is the next global design problem to solve in context of COVID and the last 2 years. What are your views? What's the shit that we need to get together?
You're talking about dignity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very closely related to what I've just been talking about. I can tell you, I've met a fantastic guy called Bill Strickland, who created halfway houses. These are houses where people spend time with after prison. And he ran these halfway houses, and his operating word was dignity. He thought that he has to deliver a halfway house that respects the dignity of these people who have just spent some serious time in prison and are about to embark into the world. He said he went to a museum in Detroit and they had a fountain. And he thought, when these educated people who go into the museum deserve a fountain, he wants to have fountains in every one of his halfway houses. He had fresh cut flowers. He somehow managed to befriend a high-end Japanese furniture designer who created the furniture for much of his halfway houses. And his numbers turned out to be much better, like his relapse numbers turned out to be much better than a regular halfway house. So I think that these things are all very, very much connected. You see it when I see it in my own life. On a daily basis. I live on 14th Street, very close to the High Line, quite a famous piece of design from my friends Liz Diller and Rick Scofidio, that is designed with a lot of love and care, and you could call that it dignifies the people who are on it, and the people respect it. If you're on the High Line, you'll never see a piece of paper thrown out. 2 minutes from the High Line in the meatpacking district, the gutter is full of discarded paper cups and whatnot, because the place makes sure it tells you without the sign. It tells you this is a place to be respected because it respects you. I think that's sort of like how you could talk about it. And I've looked for scientific proof of that and found some. Not yet about the High Line, but definitely about the train stations, where the science shows that people are clearly in a better mood in a beautiful train station. In our case, it's very easy because we happen to have a gorgeous one, Grand Central, and a really shitty one, Penn Station. And you can try it out yourself. And if you see the two stations and you look at the two stations, you don't need any science because you feel the difference in mood. But the good news is that Penn Station recently, this year, has been renovated, and it's slowly moving over to the renovated space, and it's much, 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 much better. So I think that we now see the transformation of the worst offenders. And I am actually completely positive that we as human beings, also with the COVID example, where so many of us were stuck at home for an extraordinary amount of time, and so many of us fixed that space in our home. And then you see that this was not a punctual. This was not just me and my friends. You see it with, home supply stores, home furnishing companies were among the few who did fantastically in the last year and a half. I think that we will see a return to human beings taking beauty seriously again. We did so since the beginning, since actually we did so before we were human beings. There's proof that we already, before we were Homo sapiens, we already made aesthetic decisions. And I think aesthetics and dignity, be it a fountain in a halfway house or fresh cut flowers in a halfway house, be it a redesigned space for Penn Station, or be it a carefully, formally designed website for the tax collecting authority, goes a very long way. Specifically in our profession, in a space where we actually have agency, in a space where we can actually do something to really bring dignity back into our lives.
Thank you. Thanks a ton, Stefan. It's 1 hour and it's fantastic to have you with us. And it's we are spellbound as always. Thank you. Thanks a ton, Stefan.
It was a true pleasure. It was wonderful to be with you. Great.
Thank you. And we have reached the end of today's session. Audience, do not forget to share your screenshots, selfies, and nuggets of wisdom that you collected here on social media. Tag us at DesignUp Conference or hashtag DesignUpForACause. We are going to meet pretty bright and early in India at 8:15 in the morning. That's a 2:45 GMT tomorrow, for a fantastic panel on remote research, quite away from whatever we've been talking about today. But, the idea is, how do you actually get good insights from remote research during the pandemic? Don't miss this. And see you soon. Thank you. Have a great day or a good night rest wherever you are. See you again tomorrow.